Thank you for joining us for the second session of this one. My name is Jim Sando. I'm from the Pennsylvania Citizens Climate Lobby, and I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Joanne Logan, who's a professor at University of Tennessee, where she directs the undergraduate program in environmental science. She also teaches classes in water resources and climate change. She's a very long time climate reality member, 5 years longer than me even. And we talk about regenerative agriculture and sustainable agriculture, but Joanne likes to call it climate smart agriculture, and she will explain why. So go ahead, Joanne.
Hey, yeah, let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. Can you see it all okay? Good?
Good.
All right.
That's good.
Yeah, I came upon this term like a few years ago. So when it came, first of all, thank you for coming to this session. It's really fun. I mean, I was so looking forward to the actual face-to-face meeting with it being in Knoxville. Those of us here were so excited. But with 700 participants, I'm not sure we actually would have had that many come to Knoxville. So it is pretty great to see the number of people participating. So anyway, this is a term that I've used off and on for the last few years at different talks I've given at the Horticultural Society and some different groups around the state. But as you'll see, I'm going to move into some new terms that I think maybe might be more relevant than climate smart farming, especially in light of some new legislation that's under consideration. But anyway, this is what I started off at. And over the years, there's been so many different terms related to sustainability. I'm not even sure I got all of them, but at least I'm going to kind of walk you through what I think, what they mean, and maybe what some of the nuances or differences are between all these different words that all kind of are related to each other. So I'll just kind of give you my best guess. I didn't know, you guys can just think amongst yourselves, how many of these words have you heard before, and how many words are completely new to you, and how many words you're kind of confused about. So organic agriculture, I mean, it's like one of the original forms of agriculture, right? Because this is pretty much everything that went on before the Green Revolution. I'm not sure how many of you know about the Green Revolution, but there's a really great documentary available now on Borlaug, and how it all started. For good or for bad, it probably did a lot to increase the population of some countries like India, just because the food became much more available, because they had so many more inputs they were putting into producing it. So in some countries like India, it was just remarkable. Our own country too. I mean, yields went up 5, 10, 20 times just by adding basically petroleum-based inputs like fertilizers and fossil fuels and tractors and things like that. But there's, of course, a downside of it too. It's had huge impacts on the environment with things like nutrient pollution in the Gulf and eutrophication issues and soil erosion and pesticide contamination, all kinds of, there's a bad side to it too. So organic agriculture has been around forever, and it's really having a resurgence in the last few decades. Grocery stores have a whole aisle dedicated to it now, or a whole section of produce that you did not see maybe 10 or 20 years ago, unless you were in some sort of a local co-op or something that probably focused on organic, but not your normal grocery store at all. But anyway, it's basically the interest in organic production has increased, especially in the developed world, but it's actually increasing in the developing world. I have a family in the Dominican Republic, and 20 years ago, they didn't even know what organic agriculture was. And now, people in the Dominican Republic are getting into eating organically and even eating vegetarian, which I never would have thought a Dominican ever would do, because they really love their meat and their chicken. But anyway, it doesn't have to be on a small farm like this one here. It can be large commercial farms, and you're seeing a lot of large commercial farms. Wineries, vineyards out in California have all moved to organic production. So you're seeing it at a whole scale, from very small scale backyard farming all the way to very large scale farms and everything in between. So what does it really mean? But here's an example of a large scale farm for sure. But basically what they're looking for is this. They're looking for certification. So you can see here, this is, as I said, quite a large farm, but the USDA has guidelines that they have to qualify for certification, and they do have to pay for certification, which is sometimes a problem for some of the smaller farms. Organic food, which is what we see on our supermarkets, it is food grown using the avoiding the use of man-made fertilizers, pesticides, growth regulators, livestock feed additives, if you're looking at organic chicken or beef or something like that. The use of GMOs are still not allowed. So definitely a very strict set of rules that you have to follow. Another movement that's been afoot for many years is what we call conservation tillage. And it's been supported by the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which used to be the Soil Conservation Service. It includes lots of different practices for not leaving your soil bare, such as terracing and cover crops. But I don't think most of you know that Tennessee is actually the no-till capital of the US, if not of the world. Some of our very earliest studies in no-till were conducted at the West Tennessee Experiment Station by the University of Tennessee, and they have a no-till field day every year, except for they had a virtual no-till field day this year, which I guess was extremely successful. And they have some fields that have been in no-till out at the experiment station for more than 50 years. And when they study them, it's pretty remarkable, the levels of microbes and carbon and soil, the water infiltration and the structure of these soils is just remarkable. It's really amazing what their soils look like after 50 years of no-till. Most organic farms, some of the other types of farms, usually include some sort of minimum tillage in their operation, but no-till is very specific, and because it does usually require the use of large machinery that, like no-till planters, that actually have to slice into this heavy debris and plant the seeds for the next year. But even still, the carbon footprint is lower because you're not going back and forth over your field as often as you would be in traditional conventional till agriculture. So it definitely still cuts down on the carbon. But what is even better is when you can combine it with cover crops. That's when they notice that the soil carbon storage really starts to go up. If it's not just no-till, if you also include cover crops in the process. This is an example of permaculture, and it's kind of a hard one to describe. I mean, I think of it as involving some sort of perennial crops. So crops that either have a 2 or a longer year cycle. A lot of us might have blueberries in our yard, that would be considered a form of permaculture. So the idea is that you never till, that you plant these plants and they just regenerate and come back every single year. So a lot of it involves trees, but it can be crops such as rhubarb, and other crops that will, are more of a perennial nature. Usually such farms are organic, but they don't have to be. But most of the ones that I have visited that's another thing too, that they are organic too. Oh, and yeah, I do want to mention that Knoxville is kind of famous for this too, because we have the Knoxville Permaculture Guild, and we have a permaculture research farm in the city of Knoxville that started a few years ago, and there's quite a movement afoot for permaculture in Knoxville. So a lot of the gardens, like even the UT garden, has a section that's dedicated to permaculture, as well as the Knoxville Botanical Garden Center for Urban Agriculture also has a large section dedicated to permaculture. It can be tricky though, I'll warn you, because I have worked with Pond Gap Elementary School on their school garden that they converted from raised beds, very structured, very clean lined school garden to permaculture. And because of this whole COVID thing, it's a giant weed patch right now. So we do have to be a little careful with it. Sometimes it can get out of control. Sustainable agriculture is almost an umbrella term that's used for a lot of the practices that we see in organic production and permaculture. And it's a really popular term, but it usually has other considerations besides the farm itself. It usually includes the farm family, the local community, the society, and some bigger issues than just the farm itself. So another really popular term. So organic farms are considered sustainable, but not all sustainable farms are organic, because they can be sustainable but not necessarily be organic. Another thing that we see is agroforestry, and this is getting really popular. I mean, what a way to sequester more carbon is to include some trees in your operation. It has they have so many other benefits too, in terms of kind of replicating a natural ecosystem to control natural pests, windbreaks, water permeability, all kinds of other great issues too. So that's another popular term out there too that is part of this whole issue. This is another big word out there that's used interchangeably with sustainable agriculture. Sometimes it means that you've got some livestock involved in the situation, but you don't have to have it. The whole idea is you're trying to develop a closed loop system. So nothing comes in, nothing goes out. Everything just recycles within the farm, and it's gotten very, very popular too. Now this can be grown to large scale. And that's why I think it's very important that the CCL keep their eye on this, because if we really are going to start to make differences in carbon storage, it's going to have to be large-scale farms. That's where most of our food is produced. That's what most of the farm acreage is in. So even though we may not like everything they do, they may not be organic, they may use too many pesticides, there's a lot of other great things they could do that would help sequester more carbon in the soil. So we definitely need to keep an eye on this form of agriculture. Another term you hear all the time is ecosystem services. And right here you can see that storing carbon is one of them. So we know that this can be another really important approach of monetizing the value of a farm. And I do stuff like this with watersheds, but it would work perfectly fine with a farm too. This is the the climate smart agriculture. It's kind of a compilation of a lot of the other terms, but the focus is on climate change. So you're supposed to be a climate smart agriculture business. You need to look at the whole system, not just your farm, but it's the downstream, the upstream. And what are you doing to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions? What are you doing to make yourself more resilient to climate change? And what are you doing to make your operations more adaptable to climate change? So it's definitely got more of a climate change focus than the other systems, which think about it, but it's not the central focus. So as I said, it's looking at the whole system all the way from growing to disposing of the food. So as I said, the upstream and downstream. And why do we even care about farms being sustainable or climate friendly? Well, big parts of the carbon cycle have to do with farming. So, it actually dwarfs the 2,300 gigatons, kind of dwarfs what's in the atmosphere. So we really need to keep the carbon in the soil and even do better at getting more carbon back into the soil that we've already lost. But farming is a net emitter of greenhouse gases. It's given 8%, but if you consider all the forestry and the land use changes, it jumps up to more like 15%. And if you take some of that industrial percentage and throw it into food processing, agriculture is more like 20% of our national greenhouse gas emissions. So not great for being what we would consider it should be a fairly benign industry, but it's not necessarily. We have a lot of potential to sequester carbon in our soils. Over the last 10,000 years, we've decreased our soil carbon by 840 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide, and many soils have lost up to 50 to 70% of their original organic carbon. Because they have such a large storage capacity, enhancing them by even a few percentage points can really make a huge difference a recent estimate was that we could sequester 2 to 5 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year by improving the carbon in the soil, with a cumulative potential of 100 to 130 gigatons of carbon dioxide by the end of the century, but at a cost of only $0 to $100 per ton of CO2. So very cost effective. But it's hard to measure carbon. So this is what's going to make it hard with this legislation I'm going to mention. It's from a farm, it's a little tricky to measure. We've been trying to do it for years, and it's still not a very exact science. We know all the different ways that climate can affect agriculture. So that's the other reason why climate smart agriculture is really important, because it's not just how we're releasing carbon emissions, but also all the effects of carbon, greenhouse gases and global warming can have. And some of them, you know, we don't have a lot of control over, like heat waves. Some local things like drought we might be able to control with our management practices, but some things are much more difficult. Just an example with irrigation. I know I'm running a little short on my time. Am I? Well, I guess it's not too bad. But just converting an irrigation pump, you wouldn't think much about it, but you could convert an irrigation pump from diesel and convert it over to using a solar energy source, and then even converting it over to drip irrigation rather than just sprinkle irrigation with a center pivot or furrow irrigation. And you can make remarkable improvements in the amount of carbon dioxide that you're releasing with your irrigation system. Because usually, if you've ever been on a farm, they're the funkiest old diesel pumps you've ever seen that just spew out smoke all the time. So there's a lot of potential for them to become more efficient, for sure. So that's just one example of what a farm could do to become more climate smart, because it would make them more resilient, but then at the same time, it would definitely reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. There's a lot of really old traditional systems out there. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the acequia system out in the West, states like Colorado, New Mexico, northern Texas, parts of Arizona, that a lot of the Latino farmers and the Native American farmers have built. Some of these systems are hundreds of years old. They're gravity-fed irrigation systems, and they're threatened like crazy. They want to get gobbled up. Their water rights. I don't know if you know much about water rights, but it's a real big issue out west. Just because you're near water on your land doesn't mean you actually have the right to use the water. So they're trying to get gobbled up by the larger farms and by the cities are trying to get them to sell their water rights. But there's a big movement afoot out in that part of the country now to preserve these ancient systems of irrigation, which are ecosystem service crazy. They just provide so many ecosystem services of recharging the groundwater and providing species, and they're really remarkable. So when all of this legislation comes about, they need to be thinking of these little small systems too, and how to get them some carbon credits. Another big issue that we're doing in Tennessee, at the University of Tennessee, is studying biochar. It's made from pretty much anything. I've been to the biochar plant at Lebanon, Tennessee, that they're making biochar out of wood pallets and sewage. So what a combination. It was about 10% sewage from the wastewater treatment plant and 90% wood pallets. And then they were just throwing in whatever else they had coming in, some brush and stuff like that, and selling it and actually making some money on it. It has amazing benefits in the soil. Not only is it a way to force more carbon into the soil, but it actually helps the nutrients stay more absorbed to the soil matrix so they don't run off as easily. And then the water infiltration improves remarkably too, because it improves the structure of the soil. So, this is probably another program that could be promoted as a way to increase the carbon storage in the soils. And you can see over here, even the yield increases on crops that happen by using something like biochar. And it's mostly because of that. It improves the water holding capacity and improves the nutrient holding capacity. So this is where it kind of all comes to the end. I just had gotten an email about this last week, I think, that this is pending legislation. I know CCL is aware of it, and I know that they're, I don't know all the ins and outs. I'm not into policy and all the legal ramifications. I imagine it probably has some downsides, but hopefully it's got more upsides. And it would be basically a way of providing carbon credits to farmers for doing all these great practices. The one besides CCL putting pressure on Congress to pass some legislation like this, we have all these companies that are also putting pressure on them, saying, we really, you know, we want our farmers to do the right thing, but we got to provide some incentives to them. So this would also be run out of, I'll come back here and I'll come back to the previous slide. It will be run under the USDA, like the organic certification program is. So it will provide extra capital to farmers to provide climate smart agriculture and forestry practices. There'll be guides published on their website like they do for organic certification now. Once again, the same thing, organic certification, they have a big group of folks that provide the technical assistance to make sure they go through all the proper hoops to get certified. There'll be third-party verifiers. This is a little tricky part. As I said, it's kind of hard to measure carbon coming off of a farm. A lot of it's just you have to do with modeling because, you know, it's just really hard to do otherwise. And that it would basically provide farmers with new revenue streams by funding climate smart agriculture and forestry products. So practices, it really has some good options. So this is what I'm calling it now. I started off with climate smart agriculture, but I've grown to like this term carbon farming. Now it's still a little bit of a misnomer because when I think of farming something, I think of producing something and then moving it off the farm, and we don't want the carbon to leave. So maybe we need to somehow rework the terminology. I mean, I think intellectually everybody knows what it means, but it is just kind of a little interesting twist there that you actually want to keep the carbon on the farm and not move it off the farm. But I still think it's a great term. It brings in just about every practice you would want to do in any of those other systems that I mentioned. You can just see all of these things incorporating conservation, tillage, and cover crops, and agroforestry, and promoting species diversity, and reducing chemical inputs, and just everything you can think of. Even wetland restoration would be part of it too, which would be really important. So somehow they would come up with a value for all of these different things, and it would probably be run out of the Natural Resources Conservation Service because they're the ones that do a lot of the programming now for best management practices for soil erosion. So I would imagine they would be pretty instrumental in going out and ascertaining the level of these being done on the farm as part of the farm plan that their agents conduct when they're looking to give them set aside funds. So I imagine it would be fairly similar to that. But I like the word because it's very intentional. You know, it's not just like, oh, let's be happy with the climate or let's just be sustainable. It's like, let's get more of this stupid carbon into the soil as much as we can. Some future considerations I think we have to keep in mind. 80% of the US farmland is owned by seniors, 55 years and older, half by people that are over 75. So this is something every single one of us should be concerned about. Is going to be the transition or the disruption in the farm sector as these people retire, you know, or I mean, if some of them never retire, I guess I hate to say this, but until they pass before they give up the farm. And a lot of times their children don't want the farm, or if they do want it, they want it to break it up into subdivision lots and things like that. So we're going to see huge shifts in ownership and the value that people have in their soul for their land, you know, as it starts to become more industrial, more corporate. But that regenerative agriculture and carbon credits, I mean, it could help with this transition. of keeping them honest and making them, practice the same friendly, climate friendly, environment friendly practices that the family practice when they own the land. It's going to be tough. And the increase for the demand of cheap food is just constantly going to be hounding us of, quicker, faster, cheaper, throw those fossil fuel inputs into it, because that's how you can produce food the cheapest, and maybe not subsidizing that form of conventional agriculture and starting to subsidize more the more sustainable forms of agriculture. And then finally, because I had to mention minority operators of farms, they're a very small percentage, the Hispanics, the Native Americans, and Blacks and the Asians. They've been screwed by the USDA for decades, and they shouldn't get screwed in this program. They really, really need to be forefront. They probably need to get funds and get opportunity before anybody else does, because they really have been messed around with over the years by USDA. I'm sure you've heard the horror stories. So I am very, very firm in my belief that if any program comes to be and this legislation passes, these are the first folks that should have access to that money. So there it is. I'm done.
Okay, thanks, Joanne.
Sure.
Arthur, you have any one or two questions for Joanne before we wrap up?
Dr. Logan.
Yes.
It was fascinating. I wrote down more things for me to look up after this than I could believe. And we had a number of questions, but I guess one I was just curious about was Steve asked, how does a cover crop keep carbon in the ground?
Well, first of all, it just protects the ground. And second of all, as it decomposes, it actually gets incorporated into the ground. So yeah, so it just, because even, eventually it goes senescent, and then it would just get and the same thing with the no-till. I mean, even though you're not pushing all that debris into the ground, it does get incorporated into the ground. We have earthworms and, other things that just kind of do that.
Sure. So I guess it's two things. John noted, he said that cover crops prevent carbon from escaping. So it's, I guess it's two ways. One is putting some carbon in, and two, it's preventing some from escaping.
Sure.
Which I didn't understand.
Yeah.
But another question was, how long does it take to convert a regular farm to a certified organic?
It's got to be, it's 3 years.
3 years.
Yeah, but boy, they watch you like a hawk.
Well, that's good. We like that. We like that.
Yeah, I know there's like this feeling. I've even had my own students say that, oh, it's just a hoax. Organic is just a joke. And, I've been out, I've watched them in the certification process. It's no joke. They're pretty serious about it.
Right. We want to go to the store and buy something. If it says organic, we want to have some confidence that
yes,
really,
we do. I'm not to say, obviously there's probably some cheaters out there, but I'd say overall it's a pretty good certification.
Sure. We're all just trying to push the needle as much as we can. Another question was just hybrid plants, probably just a definition. They're genetically modified, but really in a natural way.
I think as long as they're not using gene guns and splicing and stuff, as long as they're using traditional plant breeding, just making crosses and stuff like that, I know there's no problem with that. Organic tends to want to use more of the heritage heirloom things, but not necessarily. So I think, and I know the GMO, it's the one that I think folks are still not real comfortable about whether it should be banned or not. I think there's still a lot of controversy over that. Because
what are your thoughts?
I don't know. I've got so many friends with food allergies.
Right.
And I just worry sometimes that when we start mucking around with the arrangement of DNA, that it could just trigger some other food allergy.
Sure.
So I don't know. That's the thing that would worry me the most, or like food allergies.
And that's all the time we have right now. Do you have any last thoughts, Joanne?
No, it's just that I think this, this is great that the CCL knows about this legislation and perhaps can help move it along and, keep their eyes on it to make sure that it is going to be a socially justice oriented program and not just go to the big, huge commercial people first and leave the others, out in the dust somewhere.
We really appreciate your talk, and it was very good.
Thank you.
Okay, John, you want to take it?
Thanks. Thank you very much.